Morning, everybody, and welcome to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. We hope everyone had a great weekend. We have a lot to cover on the program today. We're going to be live in 3 different events, so let's go and talk all about what we have on the agenda for today. It's a horrible case, but I want to get some more perspective right now, and joining me is psychiatrist Dr. Carole Lieberman. Doctor, I'm so glad you're joining us. Real quick, we're about to jump live into court. What do you make of the defendant and what she's accused of and what you've seen so far?
Well, there's this question of, I think that the case is really on rocky ground, shaky ground, because she's been representing herself. And although ostensibly she seems like she's making sense and so on, there's this question of brain damage.
Right.
And and then at the last moment, she asked the judge it seems like she was going to ask the judge to now have attorneys. So I think that that the whole thing is really very shaky, and it is. The case has been sort of described as the evil stepmother, a Cinderella story gone wrong, and I think that that's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, the worst kind of stepmother if she's ultimately found guilty of this. Well, there you have it. Closing arguments are done. The defendant did not put on a closing argument. Can't say we're shocked by this, but let's get some perspective right now. Back with me is psychiatrist Dr. Carole Lieberman, as well as trial attorney Andrew Cherkasky. Doctor, I want to start with you. There was a lot to dissect from this closing argument, but what I want to ask you is, if the jury comes back with a verdict of guilty, they are saying that this woman really engaged in a sadistic pattern of abuse against this 10-year-old girl. If that's true, why would somebody do this? What is the makeup of somebody to really torture and abuse a girl like this?
Well, there's, of course, the psychological reasons, and then, of course, there's this question of whether she does have some brain damage. But psychologically, the story of Cinderella and the idea of an evil stepmother, it's because there is this competition, in a sense, between a stepmother and a stepdaughter for the attention and the love of the father, of the daughter's father and the stepmother's husband. And it's interesting because in this case, the mother sort of uses projection when she said that her daughter, Imani, was jealous of her relationship with her father, of the stepmother's relationship with her husband, Imani's father. And so it was just projection. She just reversed it. But, it's not really, obviously there's something in this stepmother's background. She didn't just become this way when she married Iman and became a stepmother. There is something that, regardless of whether or not there's brain damage or what it's from, but something in her own childhood that made her this sadistic. You don't just become this way overnight, because this was such a continuous pattern of abuse. And, one of the things that's sort of amazing is how the father, a man who worked 2 jobs to try to provide for his family, how he was in such denial for years, not just those days at the end that she was starving Imani, but for a long time, since after they got married. How did he turn? How was he in such denial? Why was it so important to him to be married to this woman that he basically threw his daughter into the bus?
Yeah, no, that's a big part, that he seemed to side with Tiffany over Imani. And Andrew, I want to ask you this. She did not put on any defense. She did not cross-examine any witnesses, no objections on her part, did not provide an opening statement, did not provide closing arguments, chose not to testify on behalf of herself. And she's writing there, sitting there, really doing nothing. Have you ever seen anything like this? I mean, what is going on here? I really can't figure it out.
I've never seen anything like it, whether it's pro se or whether it's an attorney making the decision. Sometimes, obviously, you make the decision not to put on a case. You make a decision that it's not beneficial to put on witnesses. You make a very short argument on one side or the other, but it's really unheard of. I mean, I think we are all biased towards the idea of there must be some sort of logic in what's going on here. But we have to remember, I mean, assuming she is as guilty as she appears to be, this is a person who is just totally disconnected from reality, humanity, logic. So the fact that she's acting this way is very much in line with, I think, the total what she's showing overall with regard to the way she operates in life.
Yeah, and it's chilling to see. It's ultimately going to be in the jury's hands to decide her fate. Let's take a break. When we come back, we have more to discuss, including the Tiffany Moss trial. We'll be right back. Okay, and as you see, the jury is now deliberating. Andrew, let me ask you this. With the defense not putting on really any defense, what do you think the jury is deliberating in that room?
Well, it's not an automatic guilty finding in any case. It really doesn't matter theoretically what the defense does. It's about the imagination that the jury has as to whether there is a doubt, whether there is something that reasonably could have happened in a different fashion than what's alleged. And when you look at murder allegations, it's actually a quite high standard to talk about what's in the mind of the defendant. So, well, at least to an extent. I mean, what they're actually looking at are the elements of what the judge says must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Is this more than just child neglect? Is this something that rises to the level of a design to bring about the death of this child? So really, at the end of the day, it's not about what the defense does or what the defense says. It's about whether the members of the jury are able in their minds to discount every other reasonable possibility other than that which is presented.
Well, Andrew, let me ask you this. They didn't just charge her with murder, they charged her with felony murder too, which means not necessarily, which we all know how first-degree murder works. Felony murder would really be in this case that as a result of the child abuse, this girl died. I mean, they went two different avenues to try to hook her.
Sure. So anytime that there's a felony and a death is caused in the course of committing that felony act, you have that idea of felony murder. So it's not necessarily an automatic connection that's drawn between the two. They have to be reasonably connected from one to the next. So I mean, I'm doing my best here to give a bit of a defense perspective, to give an idea of how the jury could have some pause with some elements. But I mean, at the end of the day, in this case, this is about as much of a slam dunk as you have. You have all of the evidence in front of you that there was a horrendous series of events leading to the starvation of this young child. I mean, they're going to come up with that verdict, and I think relatively quickly.
Well, Andrew, what you just said was more of a defense than we've heard throughout the course of this trial. Doctor, let me ask you this. We watched her throughout this whole case. I was watching her, not providing any objections, not giving an opening statement, not giving a closing argument. You had mentioned something earlier. There might be a detachment with reality, or maybe just not an appreciation for what's going on right now. But she, in my opinion, and I am not proficient in this at all. This is not my area of expertise. She seems to just not appreciate really what's happening here, or doesn't seem to care. I mean, what do you make of her demeanor throughout this whole case?
Well, you know, she does respond when the judge asks her a question. She seems to respond fairly quickly. She doesn't give much, you know, she says, "No, Your Honor," or "Yes, Your Honor," or whatever. But it's not like she is in a fog. But she's not, what I think is more evident or more disturbing is that she doesn't seem, when they're talking about all these horrible things that she allegedly did to her daughter, her stepdaughter, there's no emotion. You know, it's, you know, the jury is apparently upset, and these, you know, they talk about these pictures being really hard to look at and so on, and yet Tiffany does not look disturbed at all, or any kind of emotion on her face. She is totally blank, and that you know, that goes along with someone who could be that sadistic to have done all of these things to her stepdaughter.
No, absolutely right. And one other thing is we watch her sitting there alone. Andrew, what is it like for the prosecution here to go up really not against the defense? Is it an easier case for them? Can they have more leeway? I mean, let's not forget, she didn't object to anything during the course of examination of these witnesses, which means no hearsay objections. I mean, nothing like that. Is it easier for the prosecution in this kind of case?
I think it's actually a little terrifying because, as a guest I think said last week, The real defense in this case is the appellate court. So the prosecution's going up against the appellate courts in how they proceed throughout the presentation of evidence. They've got to make sure that they don't make a misstep that's going to be declared to be a material issue on appeal. And if a death penalty is issued, we know what those appeal processes look like. There's going to be every inch of this case looked at. So there is a certain terrifying aspect to prosecuting a case with no defense, with no objections, and with the ability to try to, quote unquote, get away with something that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get away with. Well, here, even if you get away with it at trial, you know that could cause issues later on appeal.
And this case is all about Tiffany Moss, but Doctor, you had mentioned something to me earlier, that the idea of there's more people to blame here, that ultimately the death of Amani is not just the result of the parents, but you had also mentioned that the government services might be to blame as well. Is that correct?
Yes, clearly they dropped the ball. It wasn't like they were just contacted once. They were contacted several times. Plus, the mother had already been convicted in an earlier case, in regard to what the abuse of Imani. So, they knew that there was something really solid here, something serious, and yet they just didn't keep, especially another red flag, when she started homeschooling her. I mean, that would have been another red flag, and yet they didn't come to check on her, at least not where, she was already getting much thinner. Something else, Tiffany is not only jealous because of her husband giving attention to Imani, but also I think she was jealous of Imani being so adorable. She cut her hair off, killing her by starving her, making her look really ugly in her last days. I mean, she could have given her poison, for example, or when she really tortured her, she could have, if she wanted to have an excuse, she could have said, tried to make it look like Imani did get into some kind of household cleanser, for example, and to try to say that it wasn't her fault. But she did a starvation, a torture of her.
Yeah, look, we use the term left to die. Someone is left to die. This trial, this case, this is precisely what this means. We're waiting to see what the jury will ultimately do and come back with. Now, Andrew, she has filed a lawsuit against, multiple agencies that she argues, could have prevented what ultimately happened to Imani. This includes the Division of Family and Children's Services. What do you make of that lawsuit? Could she have a successful grounds here?
I think she can. Where you have a government agency that's on notice and they have a certain duty to act in a way to protect its citizens, there is a valid ground for that. In fact, we do that at our law firm. We sued the government for various sorts of conduct where they had a duty to engage in certain conduct. Here, we have the agency being contacted on a number of occasions. So it's really going to be a determination of how involved they were, whether they missed certain signs that they should have been focusing in on, and whether they failed in those duties or if they did everything that they could.
Yeah, she's seeking unspecified damages for the full value of the economic and non-economic value of her life that she had lived. What does that mean?
Well, it means that they don't want to put a number on it right now. They would rather let the case proceed, see what a judge or jury, depending on the way that the case plays out in civil court, they want to see how that plays out. If you put a number on it early on, oftentimes you can't get more than that. So they're really just trying to get the full amount possible under the circumstances.
Doctor, I want to go back to you about this case in particular. How does it relate to other cases you've seen or may have seen of child abuse? I mean, if she is ultimately found guilty, this is some really heinous stuff. This is somebody who deprived a child of what she needed to live. There's obviously, we heard about this case about disciplining a child. We heard it from Iman Moss. But for you, when you hear about this and you hear about how parents' relationship with children or step-parents' relationship with children, how does this fit in?
Well, this has to be one of the worst cases of child abuse and, of course, murder. Because of the length of the time of torture, and also it's one of the worst cases in terms of the neglect of the DCFS, because yes, they were warned time and time again before she was ultimately killed, and so it's really unfortunate. Like in so many states, I mean, certainly in California, DCFS makes so many wrong decisions. We've had a number of cases where they seem to be increasing, where DCFS has left children in homes where they then ultimately are tortured to death or are abused to death.
Right.
And also the other way, sometimes they take children away from homes that they shouldn't be taking them away from. I mean, DCFS needs to be improved in all over the United States.
And let me just ask you one more question, if I can. If she's found guilty, does this mean that she didn't think, do you ever get the sense that she didn't think what she was doing was wrong? I mean, if we talk about people disciplining children or even not paying attention to children, didn't she not think what she was doing was wrong?
No, I think she knew what she was doing was wrong. I mean, and if she didn't at the beginning, certainly she had a wake-up call when she was convicted. No, she knew what she was doing, and I think she was reveling in it.
That's interesting. Disturbing, nonetheless. Andrew, final thoughts for you as we come to the conclusion of this case. You have about 30 seconds.
I think we're going to see a verdict very soon. I think that verdict is going to be very decisive. I think it's going to answer a question for this little girl's death that is favorable to the prosecution. And ultimately, I think that we're going to see the death penalty in this case.
And that would be the next chapter. And maybe we would see the defendant, if she's convicted, trying to do something in her penalty phase. Clearly, what we heard today is that she will be representing herself. The judge denied the motion from her standby counsel to jump in. And it's an interesting move, nonetheless. We'll have to see. Dr. Carole Lieberman, Andrew Cherkasky, thank you so much for both for coming on and breaking down this case.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. So we're going to take a break. I'm going to be signing off, but Bob Bianchi is going to be signing in, and he's going to guide you through the next chapter of this case, as well as what we're waiting to see at 12:30, the Charles Merritt case out of California. And then at 1:30, we're expecting to see the hearing in Robert Kraft about whether or not that surveillance footage would be released to the public. A lot to talk about. We'll be right back here on Law and Crime.